This week, adapting to a changing climate. In a new report, the IPCC says that more than 3.5 billion people are highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. We speak to one of the lead authors.
What is new really is increasing evidence that the window of opportunity, the time window is closing for action, and that pertains to both mitigation and adaptation.
California's never-ending drought is bringing locals into conflict with big agriculture. How is that community adjusting to its new normal?
To top that off, when these communities come home, they don't have clean drinking water in their homes. That's a real tragedy.
And we're in Antarctica to meet the scientists studying the so-called Doomsday Glacier, which could lead sea levels to rise by 3 meters.
So it's a runaway, unstable glacier that right now might be right on a knife's edge and may in fact pass that point.
From Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York, I'm Kaylee Lyons, and this is Bloomberg Green. With attention fixed on the war raging in Ukraine just days after an invasion by Russia, there's a higher than normal chance that the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change will go overlooked. But that is, in a way, something that the hundreds of authors worried about in compiling this 3,500-page report. Among the worst-case scenarios analyzed for future warming is a world where a resurgent nationalism, concerns about competitiveness and security, and regional conflicts make global collaboration nearly impossible. Released on February 28th, Climate Change 2022 Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability focuses on the interplay that connects warming-driven impacts such as heat waves and floods to human society. The IPCC scientists determined that some impacts are already irreversible, and that as many as 3.6 billion people now live in settings that are highly vulnerable to climate change. In this edition of Bloomberg Green, we'll focus on those communities struggling to adapt to a changing environment, like California's residents engaged in a battle with big agriculture. Plus, we'll travel to Antarctica, where we spoke with mathematician David Holland about the so-called Doomsday Glacier and the very real possibility of a rapid rise of sea levels. But first, to the IPCC report. I spoke earlier with one of its lead authors, Matthias Garschagen, about the key takeaways. Joining me now is Matthias Garschagen, lead author of the IPCC report. Matthias, thank you so much for joining me, and obviously it is a massive report that you have put together. Just give me some of the key takeaways, things that are new from this report.
Well, I think on the one hand side, we're confirming a couple of things that have been there before, but what is new really is increasing evidence that the window of opportunity, the time window is closing for action, and that pertains to both mitigation and adaptation. If we were to avoid drastic impacts, irreversible impacts, and if we want to keep the planet livable as we know it, the window is really closing for immediate action. And this is something we see quite clearly in the literature, and more clearly than we saw it before.
Well, and I saw in the report talking about near-term actions that could limit warming to close to 1.5 degrees Celsius, would substantially reduce losses, but it can't necessarily eliminate them all. And elsewhere in the report, it talked about substantial damages and irreversible losses. I mean, how far gone are we already?
We see that even with the current warming, so we have a warming of about 1.1 degrees, we already see drastic impacts, drastic adverse impacts. We see that certain systems, certain ecosystems are approaching their limits of adaptation and the limits of what they can do in terms of adaptation. We also have seen in the previous years, and I think everybody can remember that quite well, a massive increase in extreme events, that is extreme droughts, extreme floods, extreme storms, forest fires, and so forth. And so we already see drastic impacts, but we see that this is going much further, of course, if warming doesn't stop there, but increases to 2 degrees, and then we see a drastic, a very sharp increase in risk and impacts if we go even beyond 2 degrees, and that is very clear.
And if you, as you say, we're reaching some limits of adaptation, what does that mean for mitigation? What is the policy prescription here, or the action that needs to be taken?
The real implication is we need very urgent action for mitigation to really keep the temperature of 1.5 degrees. If we overshoot over 1.5 degrees, if we go beyond that, then the impacts will be all the more drastic. Yeah? And even if we go beyond that, I'll give you an example. The risk of extinction, biodiversity loss, if you wish, in biodiversity hotspots increases tenfold if we increase the global warming level by 3 degrees as compared to 1.5 degrees. So that's a very drastic example of the stark differences that we see between these different warming levels.
Well, and that brings me to, obviously, this report talks a lot about the influence that humans have had on the environment. But how does that come full circle, and what happens with the environment then comes back to humankind and influences us?
Oh, absolutely, and that's very important. The report takes a very integrated look at things, because also the literature looks at these risks in a more integrated manner. So the health of nature, the health of ecosystems is very important to sustain human communities, farming communities, fishing communities, but also urban communities, which depend on ecosystem services at the end of the day. And these links are now very clear. At the same time, what we need to understand is the risks that we face in the future and the potential impacts do not only depend on the level of warming and on climate change, they also depend drastically, of course, on the choices we take as societies and the development pathways, if you wish, that we take. And really the difference in the future will also be made by whether or not societies will be able to reduce these vulnerabilities, to increase adaptive capacities, and a lot of global collaboration speaks to that also, or whether we will not be able to do that. So the risks that we see in a couple of decades will greatly depend on which vulnerabilities do societies have by then.
This report is literally thousands of pages long. It's quite extensive. If there is one key message, one key call to action that you would like to get across, what would it be?
I think it's really that for the moment, we still have it in our hands. We can take decisions to change course on both climate change and mitigation, because that will be absolutely needed in the long term to avoid drastic impacts. In the more immediate short term, the next decades, we also need to get going with more serious climate change adaptation. And also that we have it in our hand, but that window is closing, and it's closing fast.
That was Matthias Garschagen there, one of the lead authors of the IPCC report. His message, it's not too late, but the clock is ticking. Joining me now to dig deeper into the report is our sustainability editor, Eric Roston. Eric, the clock is ticking. Who is it ticking fastest for? Who potentially could be hardest hit here?
The context is that climate change is fundamentally unfair. The rich countries that put all the pollution up in the air and have caused the warming are not the ones on the front lines. The people on the front lines are people in low-lying, poor countries who are dependent on agriculture in a way the United States is not, and that will exacerbate existing inequality both within countries and around the world.
What are some examples of good and bad adaptations that governments or even companies are making so far?
This report is 3,600 pages. It covers, the whole world, and so the scale of adaptation options is phenomenal. But they lead from familiar things like irrigation, which can be sort of, a hit or a miss. You don't want to use up all your groundwater, but you want to keep food prices low. To the really novel and still controversial things like geoengineering, which is putting chemicals up in the air to reflect some sunlight and hopefully keep temperatures down a little bit, even though that doesn't solve the main problem. The scale of change is quite considerable and sort of intimidating. This report basically says that there's a lot we can do. There's not a lot we have done, but the window is closing, so we better get started.
Yep, time is not on our side. Thank you so much to our sustainability editor, Eric Roston. Now, coming up, we'll look at one community that may have already missed its opportunity to adapt. As California is ravaged by drought, it pushes residents into conflict with companies. What happens when there's not enough water to go around? This is Bloomberg Green.
An And welcome back to Bloomberg Green. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja, and here is all the climate news you need to know this week. First off, California's snow levels have sunk to far below average. This after the state experienced its driest start to the year in more than a century. The situation has officials concerned about how California will manage its dwindling water supplies during the typically arid summer and fall. Also, Europe's key coal price climbed to a record this week as sanctions imposed on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine drove traders to buy in other markets. That comes as benchmark European natural gas prices hit a record, jumping as much as 60% in Europe. The situation in Ukraine has highlighted European dependence on fossil fuels, especially those coming from Russia. And finally, President Joe Biden brought up green energy in his State of the Union address on Tuesday. Take a listen.
Let's cut energy costs for families, an average of $500 a year by combating climate change. Let's provide an investment tax credits to weatherize your home and your business, to be energy efficient and get a tax credit for it. Double America's clean energy production in solar, wind, and so much more. Lower the price of electric vehicles, saving another $80 a month that you're not going to have to pay at the pump.
And that's your Green Brief. Kaylee, President Biden, of course, has made his climate agenda really important, but the cost is something that's really a concern for a lot of people. Saw him really tackle that and try to address it during his State of the Union on Tuesday.
Yeah, it all feeds into that kind of inflationary narrative, and that's something that in the opposite party on the Republican side, they really seized on when talking about how we shouldn't be spending more money on some of these initiatives that were included in Biden's Build Back Better plan, which obviously had some difficulty getting through, therefore makes his climate agenda a lot harder. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Jennifer Zabasaja. Now, Jen was also talking about the dry weather in California. So let's focus in on that state in particular, where climate change is already forcing communities to adapt there. According to the U.S. Drought Monitor, almost 40 million people in the state are being affected by the dry weather, and for some, the taps are running dry. Last year, 973 residential wells came up dry throughout California versus just 85 the year before. Most of these sources are located in the agriculture-dominated San Joaquin Valley, where residents and farms are in fierce competition for the state's water supply. We spoke to residents in one county about how they are coping in the competition for the world's most basic resource.
Notice nobody has a lawn. At one point, everybody was fine. There's enough water for the farms, there's enough water for the homes. The farmers, they weren't using their own wells because they were getting water allocated to them through the canals to the state. But since the drought, all that water is, it's not available to them anymore. So now they're starting to use their own wells. And it seems like when they do that, now the houses around them are starting to go dry.
Chris is a water hauler, hired to truck in portable water to hundreds in the San Joaquin Valley. She works for Self-Help Enterprises, an NGO that provides emergency water services to residents whose wells are failing them. In 2021, 973 residential wells came up dry throughout California. Just 85 did the year before. Most of these wells are in the heart of the San Joaquin Valley, one of the world's most productive agricultural regions.
The water comes through that pipe, goes into our tank, and then it comes back out, goes down into that tank, into the pump right here, and they pump it through our old existing well into the places in the house. We did run out completely. We had no water for a few days, and it was so hard. You either ran down to Pilot and took a shower, went to someone's house, or you just went and bought bottled water and did sponge baths.
The demand has been pretty high. Average, during peak drought during summer, we were getting over 25 calls a day with domestic well owners calling in saying their well has gone dry. Madera has been hit pretty hard, and so has Tulare County, but the entire valley has been pretty dry.
And so right now we're in the city of Madera, a real hot spot during this year's drought. You'll see really all throughout the Central Valley, which is nut trees. And there's nut trees for tens, maybe even hundreds of miles, stretching all throughout the basin of the Central Valley.
California's Central Valley is kind of the America's like breadbasket of food, right? And it can cause some problems between the local population and the farmers, right? Agriculture consumes like 80% of California's water, and that's a lot of water.
It's just getting worse instead of better. And I know the farmers need water because without the farming, we're not going to have food. But they go down so deep because they don't have the irrigation like they used to.
California's water supply comes from a lot of different sources. We get rain and snow in the winter. That provides runoff to our rivers and to our reservoirs. But we're also very dependent on what's called groundwater, that is underground aquifers that often consist of water that's been there for thousands of years, that has been laid down by nature over time. Groundwater comes from rainfall that falls on the ground and then slowly seeps into these underground aquifers. And one of the big challenges with California groundwater today is that we're pumping it out much faster than nature naturally replenishes it. As groundwater levels drop, shallow groundwater wells dry up. Those wells tend to be the wells that supply our local communities or our local towns in the Central Valley of California, whereas agricultural interests are able to drill much deeper wells and continue to overdraft groundwater. And the consequences are really being felt by frontline communities, by poor farming communities, by disadvantaged agricultural communities that are seeing wells dry up faster.
A lot of the communities that we see are farm working communities who wake up 4 or 5 in the morning to go attend to these farms. A lot of these communities are really dependent on these farm owners to provide the resources in terms of paying jobs. So right now, if a household in the Central Valley well went dry, they would have to probably wait about 8 months until they're able to install a new well or to deepen their existing well. And the cost of those wells are ranging about $40,000 per each well. And so for a lot of these communities, that's more than they make in a year.
Coming up, rising sea levels could cost humanity $25 trillion a year by the end of the century. We head to Antarctica to speak to the scientists conducting key research on how long we have to adapt. This is Bloomberg Green. Welcome back to Bloomberg Green. I'm Kaylee Lyons at Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York. One of the biggest threats to humanity from climate change is rising oceans. Bournemouth University says yearly costs could top $25 trillion in 2100 if defenses aren't upgraded. And one Antarctic glacier threatens to spell disaster for an unprepared world. The southern continent is home to one of the largest chunks of ice on Earth, the Thwaites Glacier. Sometimes called the Doomsday Glacier, it could be responsible for a 3-meter rise in sea levels alone if it breaks off. It's why scientists are racing to find out how close it is to total collapse and what that could mean for future sea levels. Our Danielle Bochove spoke with mathematician David Holland from NYU, one of just a few thousand scientists currently in Antarctica, to find out just how much time we have to prepare.
I'm on a glacier on an ice shelf. Thwaites is about 50 nautical miles that way to the east. When we arrived here a couple of weeks ago, a massive iceberg, some 40 by 30 miles wide, blocked our icebreaker from getting close to Thwaites. So we're in plan B now. We're studying a glacier next to Thwaites.
And that is the DOTSON ice sheet, correct? What are you trying to learn from that?
The DOTSON is very similar to Thwaites, its sister. It's not a threat the way Thwaites is, but the physical processes are similar. So we learn a lot by studying this one.
So let's take the conversation back to Thwaites, though. I mean, there are a lot of glaciers, obviously, at the top and bottom of the world. What is so important about that one in particular? Is it just the size?
It's the size, but also it's the geometry. It has a kind of an unusual shape in that when you start at the coastline of Antarctica at Thwaites, and you work your way inland back to South Pole, the bed underneath it, the seafloor becomes deeper and deeper. So as it melts, there's more and more ice to melt. So it's a runaway, unstable glacier that right now might be right on a knife's edge and may in fact pass that point.
And so when you talk about the knife's edge, and obviously this comes back to this idea of rising sea levels, is the concern primarily the speed at which it's melting, or is the concern the possibility that it collapses?
Both. So the collapse will only happen if the melt happens. So it's a domino effect. If we go backwards, Thwaites could indeed collapse, but that would be because warm ocean water went underneath it and caused it to melt. Thwaites is unique in that it's melting faster than any other glacier on Earth, and it's at the same time the one we think is the most vulnerable. So it's a very weird 1-2 punch happening there at the moment.
And this is in fact sometimes called the Doomsday Glacier. Is that hyperbolic, or what are the kind of worst case scenarios that scientists like yourself are trying to refine?
It's very likely its time is up, but really the research is going on is to figure out when that would happen. It's not going to happen this year. Could it happen in a decade? Possibly, very unlikely. Decades, more likely, centuries for sure. So the science research is to figure out when. And what it's all about here is collecting data so we can do a global glacier sea level forecast. Last night, we drilled down about 500 meters through this ice sheet with that tower. We put on a very long wire, we put a temperature sensor down below, and right now it's 500 meters below my feet, down in the waters of the Pacific Ocean.
Taking those readings, you can kind of extrapolate, you can do like a mathematical algorithm, is that right? To sort of try to predict how quickly things are melting?
That's exactly right. At airports around the world, there are temperature sensors, and then there's something called the weather equation. It's a mathematical equation, and that is the forecast that shows up every day on your television or your iPhone. And this is an attempt at solving an equation that's way more difficult, a glacier equation. We do know that in the past, there's been a century with 15 meters of sea level in 1 century. I'm not saying that's happening this century. I'm saying things like this have happened, and we cannot now put a timeline on when this would happen because we don't have forecasts.
I had read that Thwaites might be a potential site, I guess, for future climate engineering, like, you know, maybe building sort of massive berms or something to try to hold back the water. Just the sheer scale of that seems incredible to me, but I know the stakes are also very high. So I'd be very interested in knowing how you feel about that as a possibility.
Thwaites does hold the possibility to change the global coastline by ultimately down the road by something of scale 3 meters, say. Like Florida, for example, only has an elevation of about 3 meters. So we're talking about a massive potential change on the planet. The question is, can we do anything about it in terms of geoengineering? That is a very dangerous proposal. Mother Nature is very strong, and we are not quite yet up to the task of dealing with that, nor do I think manipulating or engineering it. Everything is a story about the wind on the planet. The wind controls the ocean controls the glacier. There is a scientific publication that suggests that the winds in this vicinity of the Amazon Sea are being affected both by natural variability, which they always are, but there's also now a strong suggestion of a signal of greenhouse gas affecting the temperature of the planet, affecting the wind. Rather than opinions, this is scientific endeavor to try to understand that. And the answer to that at the moment is probably yes.
That was David Holland there by the Thwaites Glacier, a river of ice the size of Florida. But despite the threat there and drought in California, the key takeaway from the IPCC report is that it's not too late to adapt. That's it for this week's edition of Bloomberg Green, but you can keep the conversation going by following us on YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter @Climate. I'm Kaylee Lyons from Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York, and this is Bloomberg Green.